Hello, everybody. This is Kenneth with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to talk to our special guest, Beth Hawkins, who I'm sure you all know from a variety of places. But today we're talking to Beth Hawkins, the parent, and her experience in special education, and to talk about some of the changes with the CDD and how that's going to impact special education. How are you doing today, Beth?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And as you know, we are trying to do our best to give people some more information around the CDD and continue to track and monitor the implementation of the CDD. And so special education is obviously a huge, huge part of this. And so we're excited to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in special education in Minneapolis and what changes are coming. But I actually wanted to start and hear your perspective around what have been your experience in navigating special education services for your child in Minneapolis public schools, and what were some of the challenges that you went through with that?
Like lots of special education parents, I had lots and lots of questions about my daughter, my younger child, Mandy, in the years before she was diagnosed as on the autism spectrum. Just lots of unanswered questions. I mean, she's clearly brilliant. She was tracked early on into a gifted and talented program.
Yeah.
But then when it became clear that we were heading down the disability diagnosis path, that option closed up. They told us they didn't do twice exceptional is the jargon that's used in that situation. So
What does twice exceptional mean, if you don't mind explaining?
both gifted in terms of IQ and other facilities capacities, and exceptional in that you have an exceptionality such as a disability.
Okay. Okay.
Um, Twice exceptional kids are in really tough spots in most places because special education is just not set up to accommodate them.
Okay.
And gifted and talented services are usually not offered to them, but
Mhm.
that's a whole nother program. So we'll have to
Yeah.
come back another day.
Yes, for
Um,
sure.
so when my daughter was first diagnosed, she was at, I had paid for expensive testing because I was concerned that the testing be accurate and that I could then use it to find a school that would be able to meet her needs.
Mhm.
So I moved into the Kenny Community School attendance boundaries once all of that had happened, and asked for the school system to evaluate her and open the IEP process. And it was a relief. It was such a relief.
Mm.
We finally started to have answers. There was a staff in the school that just embraced her and saw all of her gifts. And we were able to work a lot of things out in her last 2 years in elementary school.
Yeah.
Uh, and it was just wonderful. And then at the end of fifth grade, her case manager, the special ed teacher who had been responsible for her for 2 years, said that we were going to go across the park to Anthony Middle School and have a meeting about how middle school would start.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite understand why her current case manager was so insistent on controlling this process. But when we got to the middle school, her new teacher started in on a discourse about her expertise and her plan. And she had assigned Mandy to remedial classes.
Mm.
And there were no specialists. There were none of the things that make school fun.
Mhm.
Um, and Mandy's elementary teacher said, yes, I was concerned about this, and here are her test scores. And she hauled out all of her MCAs. And at that point, Minneapolis was still administering the MAP and all of her other things, and offered them to the middle school teacher as proof that my child could achieve.
Mm.
Um, and I didn't understand. I had no idea at the time what was going on. I had been a full-time K-12 education reporter for years.
Yeah.
And I had written about special ed, and I knew that the elementary school teacher was protecting us.
Mhm.
I didn't really understand the size of the train that middle school was aiming at us. And because you told me that these videos are best kept short, I can cut to the chase that 2 years later, I pulled her out of school at the suggestion of the district's conciliation officer.
Wow.
She had some teachers who embraced her. She had an English language arts teacher who adored her and who he knew watching her that she was engaged with the material, and he fed her a constant stream of interesting stuff. She also had a math teacher who was insistent that she had to use a pencil to show her work. And people with autism often have sensory issues that are invisible to the rest of us or imperceptible to the rest of us. And, you know, the scratching of a pencil, and can be so overwhelming that you can't think about the equation or sit still or, you know, the million other things somebody with sensory issues is trying to juggle in a classroom. You know, I at one point volunteered to buy her an Apple Watch, but the teacher was just insistent she had to show her work in pencil because that was the rule. And I actually wrote a story about that for the journal Education Next, the problem with pencils. There was some bullying that went on, and she was not protected from that. So we finally rejected an IEP, which basically by the middle of 7th grade, I had figured out how much power I had.
Yeah.
And I said, no, I'm not going to sign this plan. And the nice guy, the district compliance officer, came out from the central office and ran a series of meetings. And some point in, I think it was April of that year, he said to me, I need to leave you time to get a plan B in line because I can make the teacher rewrite the IEP over and over and over again, but I can't change her mindset. So to make a long story short, I enrolled Mandy in a charter school that I had written about, where every kid was approached on an individual basis. And it was not entirely smooth sailing for the next few years, but they did recognize her as college worthy.
Yeah.
And she was able to attend PSEO, and they helped her apply to 6 selective colleges, and she got into all of them. So very different belief set.
Yeah.
And the piece of this that maybe is helpful to people who are at the beginning of this sorting funnel, you know, where I was when I was trying to figure out what my child's different needs were, is parents are highly dependent on their child's teachers, special education and general education, to tell them how to advocate for their kids. And it took me years, you know, and I am obviously a loudmouthed person who's like no stranger to controversy or conflict. It took me years to figure out that, as uncomfortable as it was, I was going to have to argue with my child's advocate. I was going to have to dig in and say to her teacher, you know, yes, I know that you are the person who is caretaking my kid during the day, but I'm going to push you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, you know, something, and you and I have talked about this, you know, that's something that parents of color also really struggle with, right? 100% is that they have to, you know, advocate so hard and understand and respect so much like the teacher in the classroom and what the teacher is offering, and also saying like, I know my child and I know what they need. And then this like lack of trust, it's really, really difficult. And so it's something that we've talked about so often, and you and I have talked about, you know, often as well.
And I think the basic difference is affluent white ladies like me, you know, like we're used to getting exactly what we want.
Yeah.
We're used to throwing our entitlement around and having the system respond. And when that doesn't happen, boy,
yeah,
you know, we scream really loud.
Yeah. And so with all of this happening, right, now we have so that's the current context around what's going on, what, you know, many families I imagine are experiencing in special education and trying to navigate that system. And we now have a huge comprehensive district design that is taking place right now. The implementation of that is taking place right now in Minneapolis. And, you know, special education wasn't the first conversation that everyone was having during that process. And so, and also was probably one of the last decisions that were made publicly, or maybe not as publicly as we'd have liked to have. And so it makes it difficult to have a conversation around communication and how the district is communicating those decisions and what options and opportunities and choices are available to students and families in special education. And so, what have you heard from families in terms of their questions and their concerns in terms of what's shifting and what's changing in Minneapolis due to the CDD?
So I have spent time in conversation on social media in disability specific forums,
Hmm.
um, conversing with parents who are having a hard time at school open houses, hearing how their child would be accommodated at a particular school, what services are or aren't available at that school, what their child's day would look like, whether there is appropriate staff to accommodate their child's specific needs, educational needs or social emotional needs. Lots of questions about transportation. When your child, it's special education, specialized transportation for children who need it and
Hmm.
qualify for it for a host of reasons,
Right.
is a huge, huge issue in special ed. And individual parents seemingly given contradictory information.
Yeah.
One part, and navigating the district website is impossible,
Yes.
raises more questions than it answers. So, I think to a person, all of the people that I've heard complain that they went to various digital open houses and didn't get their questions answered sort of said, well, if staff can't tell me what my child's day will look like,
Mm.
how are we supposed to believe that they're going to be served well in a general education setting?
Yeah.
That, we talk a lot about inclusion, which is the really excellent goal of all of this.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not clear that everybody who needs to be involved in serving a special education child in a general education classroom is lined up behind that goal or has the skills and the capacity to make it happen.
Yeah, and that continues to be a conversation in Minneapolis, and a concern that Heather and I usually bring up is the conversation amongst the cabinet and the presentation and what they're offering is really great. And we have some great intentions behind it. We have some great hopes and ideas behind it. But what the breakdown is that conversation, that presentation in the boardroom from the cabinet to the board, and then the accountability structures that actually make sure that that happens in the classroom for students. And um, when we continue to ask questions about, look, where's the breakdown? We're glad that you have these intentions, but where's the accountability? Where's the support? And where's also the belief in families that, like, families are saying that this isn't happening? And how do you respond to that? I think is something that, again, we see across so many groups of families who experience this, whether again, it's special education students and families, whether it's families of color, whether it's families who receive language services. um, it's just really, really difficult for families to navigate these systems and across these big changes, where you'd think and you would hope that the district has a communications plan, and how they're, especially for families and communities that are especially vulnerable to changes like this. That's what I've heard a lot, is just like, this is a lot of change for families, especially special education families. And like, we just need to have, there's some level of faith that we need to have, but we also need to be reassured that there's a plan, and the district's not doing a great job at explaining what is that plan part. And so that's what we've experienced, and that's what we've heard a lot about.
It's funny, not funny, hashtag. This morning I was looking at some of the social media campaign that the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers is currently conducting to protest reopening plans.
Yeah.
And one of the posts said, um, ELL students, English language learner students, and special ed students will be served in small windowless rooms with no ventilation. And my first reaction was, that's always been the case.
Yep. That's exactly what I was going to say.
They're always in the basement. They're always in the closet. There's always a little makeshift thing. And I raise it just to point out, like, the conversation is still about where is this child going to spend their time?
Hmm.
I mean, that's still the basic tension here is, are they going to spend their time in a segregated setting?
Hmm.
How much time are they going to spend in a windowless closet versus the classroom that the other kids are in?
Hmm.
And the historical roots of that are that that's how schools get reimbursed for those services.
Yeah.
You know, you and I have shorthanded a little bit level one special ed services, level two special ed services. Those levels are not set by the needs that necessarily need to be met by a child in the classroom. They're set by the amount of time the child spends in a segregated setting.
Hmm.
So, you know, the basic back and forth between parents and the system continues to be over where is my child going to spend their time?
Right. And I think that's, that's the question that we spent a little bit of time digging into is, how are students going to spend their time, say, in setting one, setting two? So in every community school, what we learned about the CDDs, in every community school, there will be an expectation that for setting one, setting two, like, you should be in your community school. And so in terms of how families and parents are enrolling into those schools, like, that's your community school will be it. And so we tried to understand, how is pullout going to take place, and I think what we learned is that it's going to be really individualized, or that's the plan. That's the ideal, that it'll be really individualized. How much time does pullout need to take place versus inclusion in a general education classroom? Um, and then for setting three, we start to see the specialized pathways. And so we'll include a link in the comments section for this video around the specialized pathway, the highly specialized pathways. So that's where you start to have the conversation about setting three. And so there are going to be schools based on, the support services that you need, and that are going to specialize as citywide programming as we currently know it. And with the citywide programming, what we learned was that if your community school, so this is to the question about transportation, if your community school does not offer setting three programming for your child, you will get transportation to the nearest neighborhood program that provides that support. So, maybe, so for example, my community school is Bancroft. And if maybe I don't have a good example pulled up in front of me right now, but let's say that Fulwell was actually providing the setting three programming that I needed, I could get busing to Fulwell. But let's say I actually wanted to go to, one that's further away, let's say Lake Nokomis or Hale or Field, I would have to provide my own transportation to Hale or Field, even though if that's where I wanted to go, because it's further away. So that's what we ended up learning about the transportation questions as to what is supposed to be happening. And again, we just talked about what's supposed to happen versus what's communicated to families versus what actually happens. And so, that's why we're doing this video. We want to make sure families know what's supposed to happen and ask the questions and push the district, like you said, with this information that being told that this is what should be happening. And we'll also include the Associate Superintendent Rochelle Cox's email in our comments, and then also the Special Education Office Manager, who can direct you to the right people to answer your questions. But that's some of what we learned about the transportation questions, which has been such a big part of, one, the CDD, but two, continues to be a huge part around access and support and choice for families. And so, what are your thoughts about that, Beth, around that system?
I mean, I have a couple of fears about that.
Yeah.
One is that regarding transportation, the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, which is the federally required document that spells out how your child's needs will be met, is king.
Yeah.
And whatever that document calls for, and that document is drawn up by a committee of teachers and administrators and other professionals and parents. And if the parent doesn't sign it, it doesn't go into effect.
Mm-hmm.
the IEP is supposed to dictate transportation
Yeah.
equally. So I have concerns about parents being told where they're eligible for transportation to, and not necessarily, I mean, I suppose it depends on how well you know your rights under the IEP.
Hmm.
You know, if somebody took an advocate from, say, Pacer to an IEP meeting, I don't know if that logic would still hold, that the district's transportation plan dictates. I think that's an open question, and I'm guessing there will be, individual skirmishes over it as
Yeah.
students begin to enroll. My other concern is a little mushier, and that is that there are students who are in setting 1 or 2, but who need some particular specialized support that may not be available in their neighborhood school, their community school,
Yeah.
and that I don't hear a clean or obvious pathway for those students to enroll with transportation in a school where that support would be available.
Yeah. I mean,
Man,
go ahead.
what Mandy was level 2 for 1 year.
Hmm.
So she needed pretty intensive support in a specialized classroom during that year.
Hmm.
And I'm concerned that since she never was in level 3, under the CDD, that support might be unavailable to her unless she lucked out and lived on the right square of the map.
Right. And so that's what it's looking like is the case. Um, and so do you know what happens in that situation? Like, you know, a student what happens in the current state as opposed to after the CD? Like in the current state, if a student needs additional services, but they're setting 2, what would happen? How would they get the services, or how the IEP handle that?
Well, in the past, in practice, what happened in Minneapolis is that your child got sent to a school where those services were available.
Hmm.
And it happened with district transportation at district expense. And I think the adult goal was kind of an economy of scale,
Hmm.
to get the right 6 or 8 kids in front of the person with the right expertise.
Yeah.
And the thing that I've been concerned about since the CDD was proposed is that what families have been told is finally special ed students are going to have choice,
Hmm.
right? Because special ed students were to some degree outside the choice process.
Yeah.
um, and that it's true that choice has been expanded,
Hmm.
but not nearly in the fashion that I think some families had hoped.
Sure.
In fairness to the district, there's a tremendous shortage of specialized expertise, teachers with the right licensure. It's a real problem in the state of Minnesota, the way that we license teachers. And I think, that's fairly noted.
Yeah.
But, the flip side of that is that this has been a conversation that's been going on since before my child was diagnosed, 7, 8 years ago?
Yeah. So to your point around the choices and how like choice is expanding again. So something that we learned yesterday was that, and this has been a question that we've been kind of pushing to get answered throughout the process of the CDD, is early on we were told that special education students would have their own lottery for magnet schools specifically. And so that is true from what we heard. That is true that they will have their own lottery. There'll be a specific number of seats held. We learned that it would be 16 seats per school for setting 3 students. And then for setting 1 and 2, you participate in the lottery as a general education student would participate in the lottery. So that they participate in the general lottery. And so what we learned was the goal for the special education lottery was for families to have at least 2 options for their specific services that they needed. So let's use Mandy as an example, right? So Mandy, if Mandy would have qualified for setting 3 services, there are at least 2 magnet schools in the district that she could choose from to participate in their magnet school lottery. So it's not as expansive as for like a general education student, for example, who, they could enter the STEAM lottery, they could enter the arts lottery, they can enter the Montessori lottery. It's not as expansive as that, but the goal was, before, we were told that there wasn't that choice. It was like, you know, all of our, students who are on the spectrum who need federal setting 3 would go to the Montessori school, and that was just it. But now, if you want to go to, and again, I don't have the exact services in front of me, but for example, if you want to go to an art school, you can go to Bethune, where they'll have ASD services for setting 3 available. So that was the change that that we had learned, that was the goal that they're trying to create and that they're excited about creating. So to your point, it is an expansion of choice, but not as expansive, and it doesn't create as much choice as general education students currently have.
Well, and I think something that I would hope the coalition would continue to push on is 2 things. One, in an effort to get those specialized services close to where children live, there are racial patterns.
Yes.
The programs that Black and brown children are disproportionately funneled into with behavioral diagnoses
Mm-hmm.
are predictably located in Black and brown swaths of the city.
Yep.
And the other diagnoses that maybe don't center on behavior, even if the root issue, that the child presents with is the same,
Mm-hmm.
are in whiter and more affluent places. And we have a couple of schools where the highly specialized school-based services go to medically fragile kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, this is harsh, but those children in wheelchairs, children who are blind, children whose disabilities don't necessarily come with a behavioral component or a neurodivergent component, entitled parents don't complain about having their kids in school with those kids the way that they would a student with a behavioral diagnosis or a student who might exhibit some behavior, say, when they are forced to use a pencil.
Sure.
So we're getting services closer to kids, but there's some bad stuff in there that I hope the district attends to over time. And then the other thing to be said about, I've completely lost my train of thought. The other thing to be said about this is that it's terrific that we are now placing children physically in a wider variety of schools.
Yep.
And the next thing that I hope that the coalition will push for is how those students actually spend their time in those buildings.
Yeah.
Are those level 3 students getting art? Are they getting music?
Yeah.
Are they getting foreign language services?
Mm-hmm.
Until my child was counseled out of Minneapolis Public Schools, she had none of that.
Wow.
Are they getting anything beyond core instruction?
Mm-hmm.
Are there special ed service minutes being meted out in a way that further disengages them from the experience of school?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's so important. And I think that, I think the CDD was a big structural step. So everything that we spend time on today talking about was really related to the CDD. And, there are so many more things that Minneapolis Public Schools needs to do to deliver a promise of a world-class education to every single student in the district. And I think you're hitting on all of them. And I think it will be important for us to track all of that stuff that you just brought up. Again, not even because there are so many shared experiences around all of our marginalized students across the district, right? And so when we talk about even how students are disengaged, whether they're receiving special education services, or how students are disengaged, whether they're students of color, and then also when we start talking about the intersection of, students who are determined EBD or whatever, and then we know that it's a higher proportion of students that are Black and brown that are given that as opposed to an autistic label or whatever it is. we just start to get into the meat of a lot of issues. And then also talking about how, one issue that's really risen to the top for us around special education is how many students are actually meeting their IEP goals as well on a year-to-year basis. And what type of supports are students receiving in order to meet those. So yeah, there's just so much to explore, and we're excited to continue to explore them, and hoping that we start to see something really change in how Minneapolis provides those supports to families. But I do want to maybe bring this to a close. Thank you so much, Beth, for your time and lending your experience and your expertise to us today as we try to understand and wrap our minds around how special education is being brought forward to Minneapolis Public Schools parents, and also to show us that like these experiences are not just one-off groups. Like these are shared experiences. Is there anything that you'd like to close with, or any last thing that you'd like to share?
I just want to thank you for taking what I know is an enormous amount of time to understand an incredibly complex issue, and for keeping the heat on, even when it probably seems you don't exactly know where to apply it. And, as somebody who has been horrified to watch parents of very young students with disabilities have to reinvent the wheel in terms of
Yeah.
learning how to navigate the system. I just so appreciate you raising this issue to visibility.
Yeah, we got to keep doing it, and I appreciate you for holding us accountable to doing that as well. So thank you for that. And with that, I'll say have a great rest of your day, and thank you all for listening.
You too.